Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth as Leif Thorson moved through the forest, his axe strapped to his back and his mind heavy with thoughts of the coming harvest. His village, nestled by the fjords, had always been prosperous. Yet this year, the soil felt different beneath his boots, and the sky seemed darker, as though the gods themselves had turned their backs on the land. Leif pushed through the dense trees, following the familiar path to the old hunting grounds. He needed solitude to clear his head, away from the worried murmurs of the village elders and the strained conversations with his wife, Astrid. She too had sensed the change, her eyes often drifting toward the sky with an unspoken fear. "Leif!" a voice echoed behind him. He turned to see Gunnar, his oldest friend, bounding through the brush, his broad frame easily pushing aside branches and low-hanging leaves. "Where are you off to?" Gunnar asked, his tone light but carrying an edge of concern. "The elders are meeting soon, you should be there. They speak of omens." Leif sighed and shook his head. "Omens? The elders speak of shadows on the water and birds flying in strange patterns. But I don't need riddles, Gunnar, I need peace." Gunnar grunted, catching up to him. "Peace will be hard to come by if the crops continue to fail. You feel it too, don't you?" Leif didn't answer, instead quickening his pace. There was truth in his friend's words, but acknowledging it felt like giving in to the growing unease that gnawed at his insides. The two walked in silence for a while, until they came to a small clearing. Leif paused, looking out at the familiar landscape. But something was different today. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a strange sound, a low hum, almost like a distant chant. His eyes narrowed as he followed the sound, his feet pulling him deeper into the trees, away from the familiar path. "Leif, where are you going?" Gunnar called after him, but Leif barely heard him. His heart quickened and his breath grew shallow as the sound grew louder, leading him toward a place he had never ventured before. After what felt like hours, they came upon it, a clearing, much like the one they had left, but at its center stood something ancient. A massive stone, weathered and covered in deep, intricate runes, rose from the earth like a forgotten relic of another world. The runestone was unlike anything Leif had ever seen, its surface pulsing faintly as though it were alive. Leif approached it slowly, his breath catching in his throat. "Gunnar, look at this. Have you ever seen such markings?" His voice was barely above a whisper, filled with awe and an undercurrent of fear. Gunnar stepped forward, his eyes wide. "I've heard tales of stones like this, Leif. The elders say they are remnants of the old world of Yggdrasil itself." Leif reached out, his fingers hovering over the runes. The air around the stone felt charged like the moment before a storm. He hesitated, but something deep within him, some primal pull, urged him to make contact. "Leif, don't," Gunnar warned, stepping back. "We shouldn't meddle with things we don't understand." But it was too late. Leif's hand touched the stone. The moment his skin met the cold surface, the world around him seemed to shift. A gust of wind howled through the trees and the sky darkened as if a storm had suddenly rolled in. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and for a fleeting moment Leif felt as though the stone was speaking to him, not in words but in feelings, memories of a world long gone. A voice echoed in his mind, distant and cold. "You have awakened what was meant to slumber." Leif jerked his hand back, his heart pounding in his chest. What was that?" Gunnar grabbed him by the arm, pulling him away from the stone. "We need to leave. Now." They ran through the forest, the strange hum still echoing in their ears. When they finally emerged from the trees and into the open fields that led back to the village, Leif stopped, doubling over to catch his breath. What have I done? Leif muttered, his hands trembling. He could still feel the cold of the stone lingering on his skin, like frostbite that wouldn't fade. Gunnar placed a firm hand on his shoulder. We don't speak of this, not to anyone. The elders will panic. The Cirrus, Leif interrupted, straightening up. We must go to her. She'll know what this means. Gunnar hesitated, then nodded. Aye, but you need to prepare yourself. The old witch doesn't speak lightly of such things. The sun was setting as they returned to the village, casting long shadows over the houses and barns. Leif's thoughts were heavy with the events of the day. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion, something beyond his control. Astrid was waiting for him by the hearth when he entered their home, her eyes searching his face for answers. You're late, she said softly, handing him a cup of ale. Leif took the cup but didn't drink. I found something in the woods today, something strange. He hesitated, then told her about the rune stone, about the way it had felt when he touched it, and the voice that had echoed in his mind. Astrid's face paled as he spoke, and when he finished, she sat down heavily on the bench. Leif, you've disturbed something sacred. The gods, they don't forgive easily. I know, Leif said quietly. That's why I need to see the Cirrus. I need to understand what I've done. Astrid reached out, taking his hand. Just promise me you'll be careful. Eric and I need you. The village needs you. Leif squeezed her hand, guilt gnawing at his chest. I will. I promise. The Cirrus lived on the edge of the village, her small hut half buried in the earth, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the ground. Leif approached with Gunnar at his side, his heart pounding in his chest. The Cirrus was a woman of few words, known for her cryptic prophecies and her connection to the gods. She was waiting for them when they arrived, her pale eyes fixed on Leif as though she had known he would come. You have disturbed the balance, she said, her voice rasping like dry leaves. The roots of Yggdrasil have been touched by your hand, and now the curse stirs. Leif's stomach dropped. What curse? What have I done? The Cirrus moved closer, her bony fingers tracing patterns in the air. The runestone is tied to the great tree, Yggdrasil, the axis of the 9 worlds. By touching it, you have angered forces beyond your understanding. Your village will suffer, Leif Thorson, unless you make amends. How? Leif demanded. What must I do? She smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. You must journey to Uppsala and seek the wisdom of the gods. Only they can lift the curse. But be warned, warrior. This path will demand a sacrifice, one you may not be willing to make. Leif's heart sank, but he knew there was no other choice. His village, his family, were depending on him. And now the gods themselves awaited. I will go, he said, his voice firm but lined with fear. Whatever it takes, I will make it right. Leif woke before dawn, the sky still painted in shades of midnight blue. The Cirrus's words echoed in his mind like a cold wind sweeping through an empty hall. Only the gods can lift the curse. His heart felt heavy with the weight of responsibility. The lives of his family, his friends, and every soul in the village now hung in the balance, all because he had touched that accursed runestone. Astrid stirred beside him, her breath steady in sleep. He gazed at her for a long moment, memorizing the lines of her face. The journey ahead was fraught with danger, and though he had faced death in battle many times, this felt different. This was no raid on a rival village, no clash of steel against shield. This was something darker, something from the other world. With a deep sigh, Leif rose and began to dress in silence, strapping his sword to his side and donning his thick cloak to fend off the chill of the early morning air. As he moved toward the door, Astrid's voice, soft and full of concern, cut through the silence. You're leaving so soon? She sat up, her eyes still clouded with sleep, but already searching his face for the answers he didn't want to give. Aye, he said, turning to face her. The sooner I leave, the sooner I can return. The curse. He faltered, then shook his head. The Cirrus was clear. I must seek the gods' wisdom in Uppsala. Astrid rose from the bed and crossed the room to him, her eyes full of unspoken fears. She pressed a hand to his chest as if she could shield him from what was to come. Leif, I've heard tales of those who seek the gods and never return. Uppsala is not a place for the faint of heart. You must be careful. Leif took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. I know the risks, Astrid, but what choice do I have? The village is suffering, the crops are failing, and illness is spreading. If there's even a chance the gods can help us, I must take it. Astrid's grip tightened as tears welled in her eyes. And what if they ask too much of you? What if you don't return? Leif pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on the top of her head. I will return, he promised, though doubt gnawed at him like a hungry wolf. For you, for Eirik, and for the village, I'll do whatever it takes. For a moment, they stood there in silence, clinging to each other as though time itself could stop if they just held on long enough. Then, with one final kiss, Leif broke away and stepped out into the cold dawn. By the time Leif reached the edge of the village, Gunnar was already waiting for him, his breath steaming in the morning chill. I thought you might need some company on the first leg of your journey, Gunnar said with a grin, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Leif gave him a nod of thanks. You always know when I need a friend. They set off together, following the winding path that led through the dense forest and toward the distant mountains. The air was crisp and their boots crunched over frost-covered leaves as they walked in silence for a time, each man lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Gunnar broke the quiet. Do you believe it then? That the gods will speak to you in Uppsala? Leif's jaw tightened. I don't know what to believe anymore. I didn't ask for this. I only wanted to hunt, to provide for the village. Now the seeress says I've angered the gods themselves. If Uppsala holds the answers, then I'll go, but I'm not fool enough to think it will be easy. Gunnar grunted. Nothing ever is with the gods. But you've always had their favor, Leif. Odin watches over men like you, strong, honorable. If anyone can find a way to lift the curse, it's you. Leif cast a sidelong glance at his friend, appreciating the sentiment but feeling the weight of uncertainty. I hope you're right, Gunnar. But I fear this is more than just the will of the gods. There's something darker at play, something ancient. Gunnar was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed. That stone. It didn't feel right. The air around it was thick, like the spirits were watching. I think there's more to that runestone than we understand. Leif nodded grimly. I felt it too. But whatever it is, I'll face it. I must. They reached the river that marked the boundary of their village's lands by midday. The waters flowed fast and cold, the edges crusted with ice. Gunnar stopped, placing a hand on Leif's shoulder. This is where I leave you, my friend. Leif clasped Gunnar's forearm in a warrior's grip. Thank you for walking with me. Take care of Astrid and Eirik while I'm gone. And the village. If I don't return... You'll return, Gunnar said, his voice firm. But if you don't, I'll look after them as if they were my own. Leif nodded, gratitude swelling in his chest. Farewell, Gunnar. May the gods watch over you. And you, Leif Thorson, Gunnar replied, his voice steady. Go with honor. With that, Leif turned and crossed the river, leaving behind the safety of his home and stepping into the unknown. The journey to Uppsala was long and arduous, taking Leif through barren, snow-covered plains and over jagged mountains. The further he traveled from the village, the colder and more desolate the landscape became, as if the very land itself was mirroring the curse that plagued his people. At night, Leif sat alone by his campfire, the howling wind his only companion. He would gaze into the flames, his mind turning over the words of the seeress and the heavy burden he carried. Each night his dreams were filled with dark visions, roots twisting through the earth, gnawing at the foundations of the world, and a great serpent coiling around Yggdrasil, whispering of doom. But it was the faces of Astrid and Eirik that haunted him the most, their eyes pleading, asking him to return to them. Those dreams gave him the strength to press on. It was on the 4th day of his journey, as Leif crossed a rocky pass high in the mountains that he encountered the first real threat. A group of armed men, clad in furs and bearing the markings of a rival clan, blocked the path ahead. Their leader, a tall, scarred man with a wolf pelt draped over his shoulders, stepped forward with a sneer. "Well, what do we have here? A lone traveler, far from his village." The man's voice dripped with malice. "What brings you into these lands, stranger?" Leif stood tall, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "I am Leif Thorson, of the village of Hjaltland. I seek no trouble, only passage to Uppsala." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the mountains. "Uppsala, eh? You think the gods will protect you on this journey?" "I think not." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You'll pay a toll to cross our land. Your weapons, your cloak, and whatever else you have of value." Leif's grip tightened on his sword. "I'll give you nothing." The leader's face twisted in a snarl, and he drew his blade. "Then you'll give us your life." The clash of steel rang out through the pass as the men charged at Leif. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, his blade flashing in the cold mountain air. But they were many, and he was one. Blood spattered the snow as Leif cut down the first man, but a second came at him from the side, slicing his arm. Leif gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, and swung his sword in a wide arc, felling another attacker. The leader, however, was strong and quick, and their duel raged on, sparks flying from their clashing swords. As the fight wore on, Leif's breath came in ragged gasps, his strength waning. But just as the leader raised his sword for a killing blow, a sudden arrow whistled through the air, striking the man in the chest. He staggered, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing to the ground. Leif turned, his vision blurred with exhaustion, to see a woman standing on a rocky outcrop above. She was tall and fierce, her bow still drawn, her eyes locked on his. "Seems you owe me your life," she called down with a smirk. Leif, panting, wiped the blood from his brow and nodded. "It seems I do." And so the mysterious archer descended to Leif's side, and the two continued their journey toward Uppsala together, though what lay ahead was a mystery even darker than the cold mountains behind them. The towering walls of Uppsala rose before Leif like a giant carved from stone, its temples crowned with golden spires that caught the first light of dawn. His breath caught in his throat as he beheld the sacred city for the first time. This was no ordinary place. It was said the gods themselves walked among the priests here, their whispers carried on the wind, and their judgments meted out in the shadows of the great temple to Odin. Beside him, the woman who had saved him on the mountain stood silent, her cloak pulled tightly around her against the early morning chill. She had introduced herself as Sigrid, a lone traveler with business of her own in Uppsala, though she had been reluctant to reveal more. Together they had made the last leg of the journey without further incident, though Leif's mind had been full of questions, not least of which concerned the mysterious stranger now at his side. "The high priestess awaits within," Sigrid said, her voice low and unreadable as they gazed at the temple before them. Leif nodded, his chest tightening with apprehension. He had come seeking answers, but now that he stood on the threshold of the god's domain, the weight of the task before him pressed heavy on his heart. Will the gods even hear me? He wondered. And if they did, what price would they demand in return? They approached the entrance, where two stern-faced priests, draped in dark robes and clutching ceremonial spears, blocked their path. One of them stepped forward, his gaze cold and piercing. "What brings you to the gates of Uppsala, stranger?" the priest asked, his voice echoing in the still morning air. Leif straightened his shoulders, standing tall. "I am Leif Thorson, of Hjaltland. I seek an audience with the high priestess. My village has been cursed, and I must speak with the gods to lift it." The priest regarded him for a long moment, as though weighing his worth. Finally he nodded and motioned for them to follow. "The high priestess does not grant audiences lightly, but perhaps the gods have willed this meeting. Follow me." They were led through the sacred halls of the temple, the smell of incense thick in the air, and the soft chanting of priests echoed from the chambers beyond. Statues of the gods loomed on either side, their eyes cold and unyielding. Leif felt small beneath their gaze, as if he were a mere speck in the vast tapestry of fate they wove. At the heart of the temple, they were brought into a great chamber, its high ceiling painted with intricate images of the 9 realms, with Yggdrasil, the world tree, at its center. The floor was covered in runes etched into stone, their patterns forming an ancient, intricate circle. The high priestess sat upon a raised platform at the far end of the room, her long white hair falling around her shoulders like a river of silver. Her eyes, cold as winter and sharp as a raven's, fixed upon Leif as he approached. She exuded power. More than just a mortal, it was as though she herself had communed with the gods for so long that their will had seeped into her very being. "You come to Uppsala with the weight of your village upon your shoulders," the high priestess said, her voice both soft and commanding, carrying across the chamber. "You seek answers from the gods, but the answers you seek may not be the ones you wish to hear." Leif swallowed, the knot in his stomach tightening. "My village is cursed, great priestess. I touched a runestone near the great tree Yggdrasil, and since then famine and illness have plagued my people. The seeress told me I must come to Uppsala and seek the gods' wisdom. Tell me what I must do to lift this curse." The high priestess rose slowly, her long robes trailing behind her as she descended the platform. She circled Leif, her eyes never leaving him, as though she could see beyond his flesh and into his soul. "You have disturbed the balance of the 9 realms," she said finally, her voice heavy with ancient knowledge. "The stone you touched was not just any stone. It is a fragment of Yggdrasil's roots, a point where the mortal world touches the divine. By touching it, you have awakened something old, something dark." Leif's heart pounded in his chest. "Then how can I undo it? How can I save my village?" The priestess stopped in front of him, her gaze unflinching. "There is a way, but it is not without cost. You must journey to Helheim, the realm of the dead. There, you will find the source of the curse, the serpent Nidurgur, who gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil. Only by confronting the beast can you restore balance." "Helheim," Leif breathed, the word chilling him to the bone. No living man had ever returned from the realm of the dead. "How am I to travel to Helheim and survive?" The priestess raised her hand, and one of the priests stepped forward carrying a small chest. From it, she drew an ancient amulet, its surface inscribed with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. She held it out to Leif. "This amulet is a gift from Odin himself, blessed with the power to guide you through the underworld. It will protect you, but only for a time. Use it wisely, for it draws on your own strength. Each use will cost you dearly." Leif hesitated before taking the amulet. It felt heavier than it looked, as though the weight of his fate lay in its cold metal. He glanced at Sigrid, who stood beside him in silence, her face unreadable. "Will you accompany me?" he asked, his voice low. Sigrid's eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, but it was quickly masked. She nodded once. "I have my own reasons for entering Helheim. I will go with you." Leif turned back to the high priestess. "How do I find the entrance to Helheim?" She gestured toward the great tree painted on the ceiling. "At the edge of the world, where the land meets the sea, there lies a hidden path that descends into the underworld. Follow the ancient runes that line the coast. They will lead you to the gate, though the journey will not be easy. Many dangers lurk along the way, both mortal and divine." Leif nodded, his resolve hardening despite the terror gnawing at him. "I will do whatever it takes." The high priestess stepped closer, her cold eyes locking with his. "Remember this, Leif Thorson. The gods are not kind. They demand sacrifice. You may save your village, but the cost will be great. Hell does not release her grip on souls easily." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Leif felt the full gravity of his task. Yet deep in his heart, he knew there was no other way. He had been chosen, whether by fate or by the gods, to walk this path. He took a deep breath and bowed his head. I accept whatever the gods demand. The high priestess smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Then may the gods be with you, Leif Thorson. Your journey to Helheim begins now. As they left the temple and stepped back into the cold light of day, Leif's mind churned with thoughts of what lay ahead. Sigrid walked beside him, her steps steady and her face impassive, but Leif could sense the weight she carried as well. Though she had not spoken much of her past, he knew there was more to her than she let on. What did you mean when you said you have your own reasons for entering Helheim? He asked, breaking the silence between them. Sigrid's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. My brother's soul is trapped in Helheim. He was taken before his time, and I intend to bring him back. Leif's heart clenched at the thought. Do you think it's possible? Sigrid's jaw tightened. I don't know, but I have to try. They walked in silence for a time after that, the enormity of their respective tasks weighing heavily on them both. The path ahead was full of danger, and though they walked it together, each carried a burden that only the gods could lift. As Uppsala faded into the distance behind them, Leif's thoughts turned once again to Astrid and Eirik. He had promised to return. But as the shadows of the coming journey loomed large before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the gods had more in store for him than he could possibly imagine. The wind howled across the barren shoreline as Leif and Sigrid made their way toward the edge of the world, where the land fell into the sea. The path had been long and unforgiving, stretching through jagged mountains and frost-covered plains. Now the bitter wind off the northern waters bit through their cloaks, carrying with it the scent of salt and the promise of danger. Leif's thoughts were consumed by the task ahead. Somewhere beyond the icy waters lay the entrance to Helheim, where Nidagr gnawed at the roots of Yggdrasil, spreading chaos across the realms. The amulet Odin had given him hung heavy around his neck, its faint warmth a small comfort against the cold. Sigrid walked beside him, silent as ever, her sharp gaze fixed on the horizon. The bond between them had grown during the journey, though little had been said. They shared an unspoken understanding, a shared determination that had been forged in the fire of desperation. But beneath her hardened exterior, Leif could sense the pain that drove her forward. Her brother's soul weighed heavily on her, just as the fate of Leif's village pressed on his own heart. The sea loomed before them, dark and churning, and nestled in a rocky cove was a small, weather-beaten ship. It rocked gently in the water, tethered to the shore by a frayed rope. Beyond it, the waters stretched endlessly, disappearing into a distant, fog-shrouded horizon. The sight sent a chill down Leif's spine. This is it, then, Sigrid muttered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Leif nodded, tightening his grip on the hilt of his sword. The high priestess said the runes would guide us from here. The sea is treacherous, but we have no choice. Sigrid's eyes narrowed. You know what they say of these waters. The dead sail them, searching for the gates of Helheim. There are creatures here, spirits that will try to pull us under. I know, Leif replied, though his voice was grim. But the living do not belong here. We'll face whatever comes. Sigrid gave a short nod and moved toward the ship. Together, they untied the vessel and pushed it into the surf, the icy water biting at their legs as they climbed aboard. Leif took the oars, his muscles straining as he rowed them away from the shore and into the vast, forbidding sea. For a long while, the only sound was the creaking of the boat and the rhythmic splash of the oars cutting through the water. The fog around them thickened, swallowing the horizon until it felt as though they were the only two beings left in the world. Sigrid sat in the stern, her hand resting lightly on her sword, her eyes scanning the mist. Her silence was unnerving, and Leif could feel the tension hanging between them, thick and unspoken. After a time, Sigrid broke the silence. Why do you trust the gods so easily? She asked, her voice cutting through the fog like a blade. Do you truly believe they will help you? Leif paused, resting the oars on his knees. The question caught him off guard, and he wasn't sure how to answer. He had grown up believing in the gods' power, in their guidance. But since this journey began, The certainty that had once burned within him had started to falter. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "The gods are distant, their will hard to understand. But I have no other choice. My village is suffering because of what I've done. If the gods can offer me a way to fix that, I have to believe in them." Sigrid scoffed, though not with mockery. There was a bitterness in her tone, one that resonated with a deep pain. "The gods are fickle. They play with us like pawns in their games. I've seen their cruelty firsthand." Leif glanced at her, surprised by the venom in her words. "You speak as if they've wronged you." Sigrid's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, Leif thought she wouldn't answer. But then her voice came quiet and hard. "They took my brother, a warrior, noble and brave, cut down before his time. He died with honor, yet the gods did not take him to Valhalla. His soul is trapped in Helheim, bound to a fate he does not deserve. I've come to get him back, Leif, but not out of faith. I've come to defy the gods." Leif stared at her, feeling the weight of her words sink into his chest. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I thought you came for the same reasons I did. For redemption." Sigrid shook her head, her eyes flashing. "There is no redemption in this world, only survival. The gods demand sacrifices, but what if those sacrifices aren't fair? What if they ask for too much?" Leif had no answer. He turned his gaze back to the sea, the cold wind whipping his face. He understood now why Sigrid carried herself with such hardened resolve. She had seen the darker side of the gods' will, the part that cared little for fairness or justice. But before he could say more, the water around them began to shift. The boat rocked violently as though something massive moved beneath the surface. Leif tensed, grabbing the oars, his eyes scanning the fog for any sign of danger. "Did you feel that?" Sigrid muttered, her hand on her sword. A deep rumbling noise echoed from below, like the growl of some ancient, unseen beast. The fog thickened, swirling around them like ghostly hands, and the boat lurched again, this time harder. Leif's grip tightened. Something's out there. Suddenly the surface of the water broke, and a massive, shadowy figure surged from the depths. It was a serpent, its scales glistening in the pale light, its body as long as the ship itself. Its head rose high above them, eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. The creature let out a terrible hiss, its forked tongue flickering in the air. Sigrid cursed under her breath, drawing her sword in one swift motion. "Hell's creatures," she spat. "They've come to drag us under." Leif grabbed his sword as well, standing unsteadily in the rocking boat. "Then we fight." The serpent lunged, its jaws wide, aiming straight for the boat. Leif swung his sword in a wide arc, striking the creature's snout and deflecting its attack. The boat tilted dangerously, water splashing over the sides as the serpent recoiled with a screech. Sigrid moved with the speed of a seasoned warrior, slashing at the beast's coiled body. Her blade sank deep into its flesh, and black blood spilled into the sea, staining the water around them. But the serpent was relentless. It reared back and struck again, its teeth snapping inches from Leif's head. He ducked and plunged his sword into its neck, the steel biting into its thick scales. The creature let out a deafening wail, thrashing violently in the water. "We can't hold it off forever," Sigrid shouted, her eyes wild with fury. Leif glanced at the amulet hanging around his neck, feeling its warmth spread through him. Odin's gift. He knew it held power, though he had been hesitant to use it. But now, as the serpent circled them, preparing for another strike, he realized they had no choice. "Hold it off," Leif yelled, grabbing the amulet in his fist. Sigrid nodded and charged at the serpent, her blade flashing as she slashed at its head. Leif closed his eyes and whispered a prayer to Odin, the words flowing from his lips like a forgotten song. The amulet pulsed with light, and he felt the power of the gods surge through him. The sea around them began to churn violently as if the very water obeyed his call. The serpent shrieked, its massive form writhing in agony as the waves crashed against it, pulling it deeper into the depths. With one final roar, the creature disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only the still, dark waters in its wake. Leif collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The amulet dimmed, its power spent for now. Sigrid stood over him, her sword dripping with black blood, her face a mask of both relief and awe. You use the god's power." Leif nodded weakly. "I had no choice." Sigrid sheathed her sword and reached out a hand to him, pulling him to his feet. "Let's hope you won't have to again. Not until we reach Helheim." Leif nodded, though a deep unease gnawed at him. He had drawn upon the god's power, but it had come at a cost. Each use of the amulet sapped his strength, and they were only at the beginning of their journey. The sea was calm now, but the path to Helheim was far from over. The mist grew thicker as Leif and Sigrid sailed deeper into the icy waters. The sea was unnervingly still now, the silence broken only by the occasional groan of the ship's wooden frame and the quiet slosh of waves against the hull. The serpent's blood still stained the deck, black as night, a grim reminder of how close they had come to death. But that battle, harrowing as it was, seemed almost distant now, as if the waters themselves sought to draw the memory away, leaving only the present, a creeping dread that neither warrior could shake. Ahead, jagged cliffs loomed out of the fog, their sharp peaks like the teeth of some long-forgotten beast. At the base of the cliffs, an enormous cave mouth yawned, its blackness an abyss that seemed to swallow the sea itself. The air around them felt different, colder, heavier. Every breath seemed to pull in the weight of 1,000 souls. Leif tightened his grip on the oars as they drifted closer to the cliffs. His muscles burned with exhaustion, and the amulet around his neck felt heavier than ever. The warmth it had once given him had faded, replaced by a cold that seeped into his bones. "This must be it," Sigrid said, her voice low and hoarse. She stood at the bow, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword, her eyes locked on the cave. The entrance to Helheim. Leif nodded, though he could not summon the words to agree. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, to flee this place and never return. But he could not. His village still suffered under the curse, and Astrid and Eric were counting on him. No matter the cost, he had to press on. As they drew nearer, the water became unnaturally calm, as though the sea itself had frozen in fear of what lay ahead. The boat glided forward, seemingly drawn toward the cave by some unseen force. "We're close now," Leif muttered, his voice barely audible in the suffocating silence. "Do you feel it? The cold? It's unnatural." Sigrid didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Then she spoke, her voice tight with emotion. "Helheim is not a place for the living. We are intruders here, Leif. The dead do not take kindly to those who tread on their realm." Leif swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "We have no choice. The curse. It won't be lifted unless we face what lies beyond those gates." Sigrid turned to him, her expression hard but her eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. "And what if we can't? What if this journey leads only to our deaths?" Leif met her gaze, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy cloak. The truth was, he had no answer for her. He had promised Astrid that he would return, but the path ahead seemed darker and more uncertain with every passing moment. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, early. "But if we don't try, then all of this will have been for nothing. I can't let my people suffer because of my mistake." Sigrid's eyes softened just for a moment, before her usual steely resolve returned. She nodded and turned back toward the cave. "Then we go forward, no matter what comes." They passed beneath the shadow of the cliffs, the boat gliding into the mouth of the cave. Darkness swallowed them whole, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that Leif's breath came out in sharp, visible puffs. The walls of the cave were jagged and wet, the sound of dripping water echoing in the oppressive silence. As they ventured deeper, a faint light appeared ahead, an eerie greenish glow that flickered like distant torchlight. The cave opened up into a massive, cavernous chamber, the ceiling lost in shadow. The green light came from a series of stone pillars, each one inscribed with runes that glowed faintly, casting long, unnatural shadows across the water. At the far end of the chamber stood a massive iron gate, its bars twisted and blackened as though forged in the fires of hell itself. Beyond the gate, the path to Helheim awaited. Leif pulled the oars to a stop as they reached the shore, the boat scraping against the rocky ground. He climbed out, his legs trembling from the cold and exhaustion, but the sight before him filled him with a new wave of dread. The gates of hell, Sigrid whispered as she stepped out beside him, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Her voice was laced with awe, fear, and a grim sort of acceptance. We've made it this far. Leif nodded, his gaze fixed on the enormous gate. The closer they came, the more his body ached as if the very presence of the underworld was weighing him down. He reached for the amulet around his neck, gripping it tightly. It pulsed faintly, its magic flickering in response to the looming power of Helheim. Sigrid moved toward the gate, her hand hovering over the ancient iron. "This is where we must pass," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her uncertainty. "But once we enter, there may be no going back." Leif stepped beside her, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Together they placed their hands on the cold iron bars. The moment their fingers touched the gate, the runes on the pillars blazed to life, casting the chamber in a brilliant green light. A low, mournful wail echoed through the cave as the gates began to groan and shift, the ancient mechanisms grinding against centuries of rust and decay. With a final resounding creak, the gates swung open, revealing the dark, mist-filled path that led into Helheim. Cold, biting wind gusted from the open passage, carrying with it the scent of death and decay. The sound of distant whispers reached Leif's ears, voices of the dead calling out in anguish. Sigrid's face was pale in the greenish glow, her jaw clenched tight. "This is it then," she said quietly, her eyes narrowing with determination. "We step into Hell's domain." Leif's throat tightened as he stared into the misty void beyond the gates. His pulse pounded in his ears, and for the first time, true fear gripped him. Helheim was not a place for the living, and yet here they stood, about to cross into the land of the dead. "We go together," Leif said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. He turned to Sigrid, their gazes locking in a moment of shared understanding. "No matter what happens." Sigrid nodded, her grip tightening on the hilt of her sword. "Together." With that, they stepped forward, crossing the threshold into Helheim. The mist closed around them like a shroud, and the whispers of the dead grew louder, more insistent. The cold deepened with every step, seeping into their bones until it felt as though even their hearts had begun to freeze. As they walked, the ground beneath them changed, becoming soft and uneven, the soil black and slick. Shadows shifted in the mist, taking on vague, ghostly forms that moved just beyond the edge of sight. Leif's breath came in shallow gasps, his hand gripping the amulet so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced with thoughts of Astrid and Eric, of the village he had sworn to save. Every step felt like a step further from the world of the living. Sigrid walked beside him, her eyes scanning the shadows, her sword drawn. The tension between them was palpable, but there was also a sense of camaraderie, an unspoken bond forged in the fires of fear and determination. Suddenly, the path before them widened, and they found themselves standing at the edge of a vast, chasm-like pit. The ground dropped away into darkness, and from the depths of the abyss came the sound of something massive stirring. Leif's heart skipped a beat as he peered into the void. He knew what lay below. The beast. Nidhugger, the serpent that gnawed at the roots of Yggdrasil. "This is it," Leif whispered, his voice trembling. "The heart of the curse." Sigrid's eyes were fixed on the darkness below, her jaw set in grim determination. "Then we face it," she said, her voice hard as iron. "For your village. For my brother." Leif swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. They had crossed into Helheim, and now there was no turning back. The final battle awaited. The air in Helheim felt heavier now, thick with the weight of countless lost souls. Every breath Leif took felt cold, as if the air was laced with ice. Sigrid stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the chasm where the great serpent, Nidhöggr, lay waiting below. The shadows swirled, obscuring whatever horrors awaited them in the depths. The whispers of the dead grew louder, more frantic, as if warning them to turn back. Leif's heart pounded in his chest. The enormity of the moment pressed down on him like a crushing weight. He had journeyed far, farther than any living man should, and now he stood at the edge of the abyss, both literal and figurative. His village, Astrid, and Eirik, everything he loved depended on what happened next. "This is madness," Sigrid muttered, her voice barely audible over the eerie whispers. Her hand tightened around the hilt of her sword, knuckles white from the strain. "Even if we face Nidhöggr, how do we kill something that gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil itself?" Leif didn't answer. The truth was, he had no idea. The beast below wasn't a mortal creature. It was ancient, elemental, something far beyond their understanding. His only hope lay in the amulet that hung around his neck, its weight a constant reminder of the pact he had made with the High Priestess. But even its power felt faint here, in the heart of Helheim. Before he could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, rumbling growl echoed from the abyss, shaking the walls of the cavern. Sigrid's eyes darted to the shadows, her muscles tensing as the air filled with a sense of impending doom. "It's waking," she whispered. Leif gripped the amulet tightly, feeling the pulse of its magic stirring within him. The ground shook again, more violently this time, as the massive form of Nidhöggr emerged from the darkness. The creature was enormous, its serpentine body covered in dark, jagged scales that shimmered with an otherworldly light. Its eyes, glowing like molten gold, locked onto them with a gaze filled with ancient malice. Nidhöggr's maw opened, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, and it let out a deafening roar that echoed through the chasm. The sound was like the wail of 1,000 dying souls, and it chilled Leif to his core. "Leif!" Sigrid's voice snapped him out of his trance. "We need a plan!" Leif's mind raced, but the sight of the massive beast towering before them made it hard to think. He glanced at the amulet, feeling its power pulse weakly. The High Priestess had warned him that each use would come at a cost, but there was no choice now. If they were to survive, if his village were to be saved, he would have to call upon its power once more. "There's no plan," Leif said, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. "We fight. The amulet will give me the strength I need, but it won't last forever." Sigrid nodded, though the doubt in her eyes was clear. "We die if we do nothing. I'd rather fall fighting." Without another word, Leif gripped the amulet in his hand and whispered a prayer to Odin, calling upon the ancient magic that bound him to this cursed quest. The amulet flared to life, its runes glowing bright as the magic surged through his body. His muscles tensed, and for a brief moment he felt invincible, like a god. Nidhöggr lunged. Leif threw himself forward, his sword raised high as he met the beast's charge. The force of their collision sent a shockwave through the air, and Leif's blade struck true, sinking into Nidhöggr's flesh with a sickening crunch. The serpent let out an earth-shattering screech, recoiling in pain, but it was far from defeated. Sigrid moved like a shadow beside him, her sword flashing in the dim light as she slashed at the beast's coiled body. She was fast, her movements precise, but Nidhöggr was faster. Its massive tail whipped out, catching her across the chest and sending her flying backward. She crashed into the rocky ground with a gasp of pain, her sword skittering from her hand. "Sigrid!" Leif shouted, his heart pounding as he saw her crumpled form on the ground. But there was no time to reach her. Nidhöggr was upon him again, its jaws snapping inches from his face. Leif dodged to the side, the magic of the amulet enhancing his speed. But the strain of using its power was already beginning to weigh on him. Each swing of his sword felt heavier, each movement slower. The serpent lashed out again, And this time, Leif wasn't fast enough. Its tail caught him across the back, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his body, and for a moment he struggled to breathe. The wind knocked from his lungs. Leif. Sigurd's voice was weak, but it cut through the haze of pain. He forced himself to his feet, the amulet's magic flickering as he raised his sword once more. Nidhugger loomed above him, its golden eyes filled with cold malice. Leif knew he couldn't win this fight. Not like this. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble again. But this time, it wasn't Nidhugger's doing. The air around them grew colder, and a dark presence seemed to descend upon the cavern. Leif's heart skipped a beat, as a new figure stepped out of the shadows. Hel, the goddess of the underworld, emerged from the mist, her half-living, half-decayed form shrouded in darkness. Her cold, lifeless eyes surveyed the scene, and a cruel smile twisted her lips. So, the mortal who dared to disturb Yggdrasil has come to my realm, Hel said, her voice like the rasp of dead leaves in the wind. And here I thought you might have more sense. Leif's blood ran cold. He stood frozen, sword still raised, as Hel approached. Nidhugger hissed and withdrew slightly, as if even the great serpent feared the presence of its mistress. You seek to undo what you've set in motion, Hel continued, her voice soft and venomous. But balance must be restored, mortal, and you have upset that balance. Leif swallowed hard, lowering his sword. I came to end the curse. My village, my people. They're dying because of what I did. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Hel's smile widened, though it held no warmth. Whatever it takes. Mortals are so quick to promise their lives to the gods, never truly understanding the cost. Sigrid, struggling to stand, managed to speak through gritted teeth. Leif, don't bargain with her. She's not to be trusted. Hel turned her cold gaze to Sigrid, her smile fading. You too seek something from me. A brother lost in battle, a soul trapped in my realm. She chuckled darkly. You mortals are all the same, clinging to hope, thinking you can bargain with death. Leif stepped forward, his heart pounding. If it's my life you want, then take it. Just end the curse. Let my people live. Hel raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Your life? Oh, Leif Thorson, it will take far more than that. Your soul is not enough to undo what you have set in motion. Leif's hands shook. Then tell me what you want. There must be something. Hel tilted her head, her gaze cold and calculating. There is something. You offer your life, but what I require is your legacy. Your name will fade from history, your deeds forgotten. You will not be remembered in Valhalla or any hall of glory. Your bloodline will end with you. That is the price I demand. Leif's heart sank. His name, his legacy, everything he had fought for would be erased, as though he had never existed. He would be lost to time, unremembered. And yet the faces of his village, of Astrid and Eirik, flashed in his mind. Their lives hung in the balance. He glanced at Sigrid, who watched him with wide eyes. She didn't speak, but the plea in her gaze was clear. Don't do this. Leif turned back to Hel, his decision made. I accept. Hel's smile returned, colder than the wind that howled through Helheim. Then it is done. The weight of the decision crashed over Leif as Hel raised her hand. The amulet around his neck grew hot, burning against his skin, and the darkness that filled Helheim seemed to close in around him. The ground trembled once more, and with a final deafening roar, Nidhugger vanished into the shadows. The curse was broken, but Leif's fate was sealed. As the darkness receded, Leif stood in silence, staring at the empty chasm where the serpent had been. He had won. His village would live. But the cost had been greater than he had ever imagined. The cold winds of Helheim still whispered around Leif and Sigrid, though the terrible presence of Nidhugger had been momentarily banished. The chasm where the serpent had writhed moments before now lay still, a dark void that seemed to lead straight to the roots of Yggdrasil itself. Yet, Leif's heart weighed heavier than ever. Hel's words echoed in his mind, each syllable like a hammer against his soul. Your legacy will be forgotten. Your name erased from history. He had accepted the bargain. The curse on his village was broken. But at what cost? The warmth of Valhalla, the stories sung in mead halls of his great deeds, the honor he had always longed for, all of it gone. He had chosen to sacrifice everything for the people he loved, and now the emptiness of that choice clawed at him. Sigrid, still leaning heavily on her sword after her injury from Nidhugger, gazed at Leif. Her face was pale, etched with fatigue and pain. But there was something else there too, anger, mingled with disbelief. She had watched as Leif made his bargain with Hel, watched as he willingly gave up the one thing no Viking would ever willingly forfeit, his legacy. "You can't be serious," she finally said, her voice low, hoarse from battle and shock. "You're willing to let everything you've ever done be forgotten? No songs, no stories? Not even your son will know who you were?" Leif clenched his fists, the amulet Hel had given him now cold against his skin. He swallowed the lump in his throat, but the words came out strained. "I did what I had to do. My people, Astrid, Eirik, they'll live. That's enough." Sigrid shook her head, stepping closer, her eyes flashing with fury. "Enough? Enough for a Viking to be lost to time? We live for our deeds, Leif. We fight, bleed, and die for the chance to be remembered. Valhalla isn't just a reward, it's our destiny." Her voice cracked with raw emotion. "You threw that away." Leif turned his gaze away from her, staring down into the black pit where Nidhugger had fallen. The silence of Helheim felt louder than ever, oppressive as if it were pushing the very air from his lungs. He had no words to offer her, no defense for his choice. His heart had not stopped aching since Hel had sealed the bargain. But he knew one thing for certain. If he hadn't done it, the curse would have consumed his village, and he couldn't bear that weight. "It's done, Sigrid," Leif said quietly, his voice thick with the burden of his choice. "I've given my word to Hel. I can't undo it." Sigrid's face tightened in anger, her jaw clenched. "No, you can't. But you've given up your honor, your afterlife, for what? For a handful of lives? They'll live, Leif. But you'll be nothing more than a ghost. A forgotten shadow." Leif flinched at her words, but he forced himself to stand tall, even though he felt hollow inside. "They'll live because of me. My son will live. That's worth more than a song." Sigrid stared at him for a long moment, her face contorting with emotions she didn't speak aloud. Then, with a frustrated growl, she turned her back to him, gazing into the same abyss that had drawn Leif's attention. "Hel's promises are never as simple as they seem," she said quietly, her voice hardening with resolve. "We still have to find that cursed artifact. That's the only way to make sure the curse is broken for good." Leif nodded slowly, though the thought of continuing felt like dragging his feet through a mire. The artifact, Hel had said, was tied to the roots of Yggdrasil itself, the source of the curse. Their journey was not yet complete. He stepped forward, standing beside Sigrid. "Do you think the gods will even let us near it?" Leif asked, his tone dark with doubt. "After everything we've done?" Sigrid shook her head, her eyes scanning the pit. "No, they won't let us. But we're not asking for permission." She turned to him, her gaze fierce once more. "We came here to finish this, and we will." Leif found a flicker of strength in her words, a faint echo of the warrior he had once been. Nodding, he followed her lead as they descended deeper into the heart of Helheim, where the roots of Yggdrasil twisted like gnarled veins beneath the earth. The deeper they traveled, the colder it became. Leif's breath clouded in front of him, and the weight of the air itself seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. The roots of Yggdrasil, massive and ancient, snaked through the cavern, pulsating with a dark energy. This was no longer a realm meant for the living. The air itself hummed with death, and the weight of Hell's gaze seemed ever present. "Look there," Sigrid whispered, pointing ahead. In the center of the cavern, nestled among the roots, stood a large stone pedestal. On top of it rested an object unlike anything Leif had ever seen. A dark orb, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Its surface was covered in runes, similar to those on the amulet, but far older, more intricate. Leif knew, without needing to be told, that this was the artifact Hel had spoken of. "The source of the curse," Leif muttered, his heart pounding. "This is what's been poisoning my village." Sigrid nodded grimly. "We destroy that, and the curse will be lifted." But as they stepped closer, the air around the artifact shifted. A low, rumbling growl filled the chamber, and shadows began to gather around the roots, taking on twisted forms. Dark figures, hunched and grotesque, rose from the shadows, guardians of the artifact, bound to protect it. "Of course," Sigrid said with a bitter smirk, drawing her sword. "It was never going to be that easy." Leif tightened his grip on his sword, feeling the cold weight of the amulet against his chest. His body ached with exhaustion, his spirit drained from the bargain with Hel, but he knew they had no choice. They had to fight. The first shadowy creature lunged at Sigrid with a shriek, its claws slashing through the air. She met it head-on, her sword flashing as she deflected the blow and countered with a deadly strike. The creature recoiled, but more emerged from the darkness, swarming around them. Leif charged forward, his sword slicing through the nearest figure. His muscles screamed in protest, but he fought through the pain, his focus sharp. He moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior, but for every creature he struck down, another rose to take its place. "Sigrid," he shouted, his breath ragged as the battle raged around them. "We need to reach the artifact. We'll be overwhelmed if this keeps up." Sigrid parried another blow, her face slick with sweat, but she nodded. "We push forward," she called out. "Take them down as we go." Together, they fought their way through the mass of shadowy figures, their swords cutting through the darkness. Leif could feel the magic of the amulet pulsing against his chest, its power surging through him, though the toll it took on his body was becoming more apparent with every passing moment. Each use drained him, but he had no choice. Finally, they reached the pedestal. The shadows pressed in around them, but Leif raised his sword, the runes on the amulet glowing fiercely. "Now," Sigrid shouted. With a roar, Leif brought his sword down on the artifact, his blade slicing through its dark surface. The orb shattered with a deafening crack, and the green light exploded outward, blinding them both. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the shadows began to recede. The figures dissolved into mist, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the cavern lifted. The roots of Yggdrasil, once twisted with dark energy, seemed to relax, their pulsating glow fading to a soft, natural light. Leif fell to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The curse was broken, truly broken this time. But the hollow emptiness in his chest remained. He had fulfilled his bargain with Hel. His village would live, but Leif Thorson would be forgotten. Sigrid, panting from the battle, knelt beside him, her eyes softened as she looked at him. "You did it," she said quietly. Leif nodded, though there was no joy in his heart. "The curse is lifted." Sigrid studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "But at what cost?" she asked, her voice filled with sadness. Leif didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The winds howled across the fjord as Leif and Sigrid made their way back to the surface, their footsteps heavy with exhaustion. Helheim had released them, but the chill of the underworld still clung to their bones. Leif's heart was weighed down with a burden far heavier than the cold. The curse had been lifted, but the cost had been unbearable. The skies above were gray and brooding as they emerged from the cave, the dark cliffs towering over them like silent watchers. The boat they had left on the rocky shore was still there, though the sea, once restless and dangerous, was now eerily calm. It was as if the waters knew what they had done, and were offering them safe passage. But peace did not come easily to Leif's heart. Sigrid remained silent as they prepared the boat for the return journey. The tension between them, palpable since Leif had made his bargain with Hel, had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened, an unspoken gulf growing wider with each passing moment. Leif untied the rope, his hands moving mechanically as his thoughts spiraled inward. His name, his legacy, all of it gone. He would be forgotten, erased from the sagas and songs. The sacrifices he had made, the battles he had fought, the victories won, they meant nothing now. It was a fate worse than death for a Viking, and yet it had been his only choice. Sigrid, standing by the boat's edge, watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. After what felt like hours of silence, she finally spoke. "You've broken the curse, Leif," she said softly, though there was no joy in her voice. "Your village will be safe." Leif nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet. His throat felt tight, as if a hand had gripped it, refusing to let him breathe fully. "And yet," she continued, her voice sharper now, "you look as if you've lost everything." He stopped his work, straightening up to face her. "I have." Sigrid's eyes hardened. "You saved your people. Isn't that what you wanted? You chose them over your legacy, over everything a Viking holds sacred. You did what was right." Leif stared at her, a storm of emotions brewing inside him. "Right?" he repeated, his voice rough with bitterness. "I did what I had to. That doesn't make it right." Sigrid stepped closer, her jaw clenched. "So you'd rather have let them die? You'd rather be a hero in the songs while your son starves, while your wife watches her people waste away? That's what you wanted?" Leif's fists clenched at his sides. The weight of her words struck him hard, but there was something in her tone, something accusatory, almost angry. "You don't understand." "Don't I?" Sigrid shot back, her eyes flashing. "I know more about sacrifice than you think. My brother's soul is still trapped in Helheim. He's never coming back. I failed. You, on the other hand, succeeded. You saved the people you love, and now you want to wallow in self-pity because you'll be forgotten? Because no skald will sing your name?" Leif glared at her, the fire of her words igniting something within him. "It's not just about the songs. It's about my place in the world, my honor, my legacy. My ancestors fought for centuries to ensure their deeds were remembered, that their names would echo through eternity. I gave that up." Sigrid's expression softened, but only slightly. "And that's worth more to you than the lives of your family? Than their future?" The question hit Leif like a punch to the gut. He turned away from her, staring out at the sea, the waves lapping gently at the boat. His silence was answer enough. Sigrid sighed, stepping back. "Maybe you gave up your name, Leif, but what you did, it won't be forgotten by those who matter. Maybe you won't live in the sagas, but your son will know that you saved him. Your wife will remember that you sacrificed everything for them. Doesn't that count for something?" Leif closed his eyes, her words sinking deep into his heart. His thoughts were a tangled web of regret, duty, and loss. But beneath it all, there was a truth he had been trying to avoid. He had saved them, his family, his people. They would live, even if his name would be wiped from memory. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, his voice hollow. "But it doesn't make it easier." "No," Sigrid agreed, her tone softening. "It never does." They fell into silence again as they pushed the boat into the water and began rowing toward home. The rhythm of the oars was almost hypnotic, the cold air biting at their skin as they moved across the placid sea. Each stroke of the oars felt like a heartbeat, steady and purposeful, yet carrying with it the weight of their unspoken pain. Leif's mind wandered to Astrid and Eric. How could he explain to them what had happened? How could he return to them, knowing that the price he had paid would mean he would never see Valhalla, that his deeds would vanish into the void? He had promised to return, but he was not the same man who had left. "Tell me something," Sigrid said after a long pause, breaking the silence. "What will you do when you return, now that it's over?" Leif didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the horizon where the faint outlines of land were beginning to appear through the fog. His village was out there, waiting. Life would go on, but he wasn't sure where he fit in anymore. "I'll go home," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I'll be a father to my son, a husband to Astrid. I'll try to live as if none of this ever happened." Sigrid's gaze flicked toward him, her expression unreadable. "And will that be enough for you?" Leif looked at her, his face a mask of uncertainty. "I don't know." She nodded, as if she understood more than he was saying. "You'll find a way. The gods may forget your name, but that doesn't mean you have to." They didn't speak again for the rest of the journey. When the boat finally reached the shores of Leif's village, the sun was setting, casting the world in shades of gold and crimson. The sight of home should have filled him with relief, but instead, there was a deep ache in his chest, a hollow reminder of what he had lost. The village seemed eerily quiet, as if the weight of the curse still lingered in the air. But as they approached the dock, Leif saw movement. The villagers were gathering, their faces drawn with weariness but brightened by hope. They had noticed the change. The curse was gone. Leif's heart skipped a beat when he saw Astrid standing at the front of the crowd, her hands gripping Eric's small shoulders. She looked thinner, her face etched with the lines of sleepless nights and worry. But the moment her eyes met his, everything else faded away. She ran to him, her arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. Leif held her, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in. Eric stood beside them, his wide eyes filled with questions that Leif couldn't answer. "You came back," Astrid whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I promised I would," Leif replied, his voice thick with guilt and love. But even as he stood there, reunited with his family, the emptiness inside him remained. His name would be forgotten, his deeds erased. And yet, in that moment, holding Astrid and Eric, he wondered if Sigrid had been right. Maybe there was something greater than songs and glory. Maybe the life he had saved mattered more than the legacy he had lost. But only time would tell. The longhouse was warm and bustling with life. The crackling fire in the hearth sent shadows dancing along the walls, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and the chatter of villagers. It was a scene Leif had imagined often during the long nights in Helheim, but now, sitting among his people, it felt strangely hollow. Astrid moved gracefully through the longhouse, her hands full of food and drink, a smile on her face as she greeted the villagers. Leif watched her from where he sat, his heart aching with a mixture of love and guilt. She had been his anchor through everything, and yet he couldn't tell her the full truth about what had happened. Not yet. Not while the weight of his bargain with hell still pressed down on him. Eric sat beside him, the boy's eyes wide with excitement as he listened to the old men recount stories of battles and raids. Leif ruffled his son's hair absently, though his thoughts were far away. He had fulfilled his promise to save the village, but the knowledge of what he had given up haunted him. "Father, are you listening?" Eric's voice cut through Leif's reverie, full of childish impatience. Leif blinked, turning his attention to his son. "Sorry, Eric. What was that?" The boy looked up at him with a bright grin. "Old Bjorn was telling us about the time you fought off those raiders by yourself. Was it true? Did you really chase them all the way into the mountains?" Leif forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That was a long time ago, son." Bjorn, seated across the fire, nodded sagely. "Aye, it was. But the memory of it still burns bright. We all saw it. Leif Thorson driving those marauders back like they were nothing more than wolves on the hunt." He chuckled, taking a swig from his drinking horn. A saga-worthy feat, if ever there was one. The words stung more than they should have. Saga-worthy, Leif thought bitterly. but there will be no sagas for me. The realization hung between him and the flickering flames, an ever-present reminder that his legacy had been wiped away. No matter what great deeds he had done or would do, his name would be forgotten. The bargain with Hel ensured that. As the evening wore on, the longhouse became quieter, the villagers slowly dispersing back to their homes. Eventually, it was just Leif, Astrid, and Eric left by the dying fire, the warmth from the hearth a stark contrast to the cold knot in Leif's chest. Astrid sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, content in the peace that had returned to their village. Eric had fallen asleep, his small body curled up in a pile of furs. For a long time they sat in silence, the weight of all that had happened between them. "I can't believe it's over," Astrid said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The crops are growing again, the sickness has passed. You've saved us, Leif. You've brought our lives back." Leif swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the dying embers in the hearth. "It wasn't just me," he said, his voice low. "I didn't do it alone." Astrid pulled back slightly, looking up at him. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken question, a deep worry that had been lingering ever since his return. "What happened out there, Leif? You haven't told me everything." He hesitated. He had known this moment would come, but the words felt like stones in his throat. How could he tell her that he had bargained with the goddess of death? That his name, his deeds would be erased from history? That he had given up everything he had ever fought for? But Astrid's gaze was steady, her hand resting gently on his arm. She had always been stronger than he gave her credit for. If anyone could bear the truth, it was her. "I made a bargain," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "With Hel." Astrid's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Hel? The goddess of the dead?" Leif nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I didn't have a choice. The curse. It was tied to the roots of Yggdrasil, to Nidhugger. I had to stop it. But the only way to do that was to make a deal with Hel." Astrid's hand tightened on his arm. What did she ask for? Leif's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the words heavy on his soul. "She asked for my legacy, my name. When I die, no one will remember me. My deeds will be forgotten. It will be as if I never existed." For a long moment, Astrid was silent, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she shook her head. "No, I refuse to believe that." Leif finally looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. "Astrid." "No," she said firmly, her eyes blazing with determination. "You saved us, Leif. You saved our son. You saved this village. I don't care what bargain you made with Hel. I will remember you. Eric will remember you. Our people will remember you." Tears burned in Leif's eyes, but he forced them back, his jaw tight. "But my name—" "Names are just words," Astrid interrupted, her voice soft but fierce. "It's what you've done that matters. You will live on in us, in our hearts, in our stories. No bargain with the gods can take that away." Leif stared at her, a knot of emotion tightening in his chest. Her words, so simple yet so full of love, cut through the despair that had been weighing him down since his return. He had spent so long thinking about the sagas, the songs, the stories that would be lost. But here, in this quiet moment with his family, he realized that maybe it wasn't the sagas that mattered. Maybe it was enough that the people he loved would carry his memory with them. "I never wanted to leave you," Leif whispered, his voice trembling. "Not like this." Astrid smiled, a sad but beautiful smile. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Leif pulled her close, holding her tightly as the last of the fire's warmth flickered in the hearth. Eric stirred in his sleep, his small hand reaching out for his father, and Leif gently pulled the boy closer to him. He wrapped his arms around both of them, feeling the steady rise and fall of their breaths. Maybe Hel could take his name from the sagas. maybe his deeds would be forgotten by the world. But here, in the quiet of the longhouse, with his wife and son safe in his arms, Leif knew that he would not truly be forgotten. Not by the ones who mattered. The days that followed were quiet. Leif settled back into the rhythm of life in the village, though the shadow of his bargain lingered in the back of his mind. The crops began to grow again. The sickness that had plagued the village vanished, and the people slowly returned to their lives. Sigrid, too, had returned with them, though she kept her distance. Her own journey had been marked by loss and failure, her brother's soul still trapped in Helheim, but she had found a kind of peace in knowing that the curse was broken. One evening, as the sun set over the fjord, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Leif stood by the water's edge, watching the waves lap gently at the shore. He thought of the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made, and the fate that awaited him. But he wasn't afraid anymore. The wind carried the sound of laughter from the village behind him, and Leif smiled faintly as he turned to see Astrid and Eirik walking toward him, their faces lit by the fading light of the sun. He would never be sung about in the sagas. His name would fade from memory. But here, with his family, Leif knew he had found something greater than glory. He had found peace. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that it was enough.